Okay, so thanks very much for great introduction. So it was very impressive to us because today we have learned a lot, especially lots of practical implications on a financial alliance and especially how to deal with the inflation crisis particularly. So basically, I'd like to have some questions to further clarify on the concepts and ideas of financial alliance. So according to Thomas' presentation, we learned some good examples based on our history. Say, bancassurance in India has been mentioned as a good example for financial alliance. So I have one follow-up question. Do you think are there any available financial alliance opportunities available in the UK in order to resolve some global issues caused by large military conflicts between Russia and Ukraine, or Israel and Iran, or even China and Taiwan? So I'm just wondering whether or not there may be some considerations in the UK at the moment.
Well, that's a nice, incredibly difficult question posed for me. But historically, you find financial alliances are more likely to form to mitigate the costs of governments forming policies, or rebel groups causing disruption, or governments taking disruptive from an economic point of view policies. So I would think that the alliances would probably be formed in the UK relative to these, these sanction regimes and global conflicts that would be try to basically be ways to continue economic activity despite the actions of governments. But I don't see many cases of financial alliances forming which could reverse the actions of governments. I mean, we don't see a financial alliance stopping World War I, for instance, but we do see many cases of banks cooperating to get around, legally, hopefully, get around government regulations and edicts and wars which are causing economic disruption.
Thanks for your answer. Then when you talk about financial alliance, particularly Glasgow Financial Alliance may be a representative example to handle climate change in the globe. But I believe there are some political pressure on some financial alliance, particularly because there are always populism politicians who are relying on large financial institutions or even foreign capital. So in that point of view, how could we further improve some efficiency of financial alliance that may be possibly subject to some political pressure?
Well, are you asking what financial alliances can do to?
So in order to handle some global issues or challenges, yes, a financial alliance may be required to handle collectively. But the issue is that we are exposed to some political pressure. So there are lots of other voices to go ahead. Rather, we may need one clear voice by the political leader, for example. So in order to lead the financial alliance, like a Glasgow Financial Alliance, so we are wondering whether or not we may need some clear political leadership to make our alliance more efficient or more appropriate to handle global issues.
Well, I think you're going to have if you want to handle global issues, I think you're going to have more than a financial alliance, or perhaps a political alliance related to at the level of, say, central banks, yeah, and things like that. I don't, but I do think again, the financial alliances can provide a great deal of are very efficacious in things like once government sets policy, government wants net zero, well, how do you even define net zero? It's actually a technically very difficult and challenging thing. And it's something which all banks will have to do, so it's a collective cost with its huge economies of scope there and scale, basically, if we work out common standards and financial alliances can solve that, I don't, again, see them being able to impose, I think that ultimately the amount of remediation required because of climate change will be something governments decide and not banks.
And let me turn to John. So,
can I just say something first?
yes, definitely. Yeah, please.
The professor's the expert in all this, but it does strike me that I think it's been a mainstay of sort of thought for the last 100 or 150 years that the more that countries are bound together economically, the more likely they are to maintain peaceful relationships. And obviously it's not a total answer, and it doesn't always prevail, but I do think that the more global, the more interconnected the world, the more likely it is to be more peaceful.
Yes. Then in line with your comments, so I think our Korean society is currently encountered by lots of geopolitical or geographical issues, such as some geopolitical conflicts between China and Taiwan and possibly Korea. So
yes.
There may be some disaster to supply chain, including semiconductor production, computer chip production, and so on. So, do you think could we handle to resolve some issues by collectively working together in the form of financial alliance? So, what do you think of this point of view?
Well, I think the geopolitical tensions that you talk about, that you reference, obviously are very real, and my guess is some of you in the room are way more expert about them than I am. In the United States, I serve as the chair of several endowment committees that manage big charitable endowments, not as an officer of Oak Tree, but in my personal life. And one of the things that there are many wise people in the United States who believe that China is uninvestable, that because of the geopolitical risks, the risk that China could attack Taiwan, that it's just not appropriate, it's not wise, it's not rational to invest in China. I don't happen to share that view. But I think the more that view prevails, and the less the countries are interconnected, then the more risk there is that there will be some sort of war or conflict, because it's less costly to the aggressor. Now, this obviously isn't a perfect answer. My guess is, although I'm not an expert, that Russia and Ukraine had many economic ties. It did not prevent Russia from attacking Ukraine, and because of various cultural issues, but I still think it's helpful.
Then, Thomas, what do you think of China market at the moment for our future investment opportunities given this geopolitical constraint?
Well, I'm really not a macroeconomist at all. I'm a microeconomist who deals mostly with, how to design small, institutions on the level of firms. But I think that the unfortunate problem is that the countries can compete with each other, but they can compete in different ways. Up until 1915, as it was pointed out by our second speaker, there were very few sanctions regimes between the European great powers, even though they were competing quite aggressively. Germany, Japan, not Japan, Germany and the UK were sort of were competing for dominance in Europe, but they weren't sanctioning each other and they weren't blocking trade, or they weren't interfering, using the financial markets as a weapon. In fact, in the Crimean War, the British deliberately decided not to do any sanctioning of the Russian imperial assets, even though they were directly at war with Russia. They thought the harm of confiscating Russian assets to the City of London would be far outweigh any benefit in winning the war. So it seems like it seems like we've reached this sanctioning equilibrium between these countries, and I don't know how financial alliances could solve that, but if someone could solve that and find other ways for countries to compete, I mean, people can be hostile to each other but still find less destructive ways, because frequently the sanctions regimes are as harmful to the sanctioners, the sanctioned firm. And very frequently they also backfire spectacularly, like the South in the Civil War in the US decided it would win the war by embargoing its cotton. And they said the world depends on our cotton. And of course it didn't work out too well. Nobody was going to send a military force to attack the United States to get the cotton. The British just started growing cotton in Egypt. And by the time they were desperate to sell their cotton, the Union had blockaded their ports. Or Napoleon thought it was a great idea too. Basically, he would defeat the English by basically blocking holding all European goods in Europe. The English couldn't become involved in the trade, and it just bankrupted the French ports. So I mean, there are other ways to compete, and hopefully somehow someone could convince our world leaders that the sanctions regimes are not the way to go. That would be wonderful.
Any further comments or suggestions on this topic? Then let me go back to some inflation issues. Basically, could you kindly guide us some implications of inflation risk on our current investment and risk management decisions? Basically, for example, where and which country do we need to have a particular interest for our future investment opportunities given this inflation crisis? That's what I think.
So I alluded during my remarks that I'm probably about the oldest person in this room. And as a result, I probably remember a lot more about inflation than many of you. When I was in college in the United States, I graduated in 1978. And while I was in college, I'm going to say enjoy, but we didn't enjoy it at all. We experienced in the United States something that was called stagflation, which was inflation combined with very, very little growth. And that was a disaster because it really undermined people's standard of living. And one of the things that I came away from that experience believing is that inflation, once embedded, is way harder to eradicate or eliminate than I think most people think. In the United States, we only got rid of inflation because a Fed chairman named Volcker took very, very strong action that put the United States into a significant recession. In England, the professor would know much more about it than I do, but significant acts that imposed a lot of pain on people were taken in order to combat inflation. So my own personal view is that inflation is more difficult to tame than many people think. I see signs of that already in the United States, where inflation numbers have been less positive, or they've been higher than most people expected they would be, notwithstanding the Fed's increase in interest rates. And it's the reason why the Fed keeps putting off what people had anticipated would be reductions in the Fed rate. And that's because I believe that once inflation becomes embedded in the labor market, it becomes an ever-increasing cycle. Now, to answer your question, which is, if you believe that inflation could be an issue, then what opportunities or what risks does that create? At Oak Tree, the professor said that Professor knows you said you're a microeconomist, not a macroeconomist. I would say the same thing about us at Oak Tree. We're very, very aware at Oak Tree that there are two kinds of people in the world. I think Lord Keynes first said this. There are people who don't know, and then there are people who know they don't know. And at Oak Tree, we try to remember that we are people who don't know. None of us knows the future. Even within the last year, lots of things have happened that we didn't anticipate. So we try to be very, very humble about what it is we know and we don't know. And in our case at Oak Tree, we believe that since you can't tell the future, what you can know is you can know an awful lot about a particular issuer, you can know an awful lot about particular securities, and then you can extrapolate from that very significant specific knowledge more to the macro, and you can run simulations, either literally economic simulations or just simulations in your mind, about what would happen if inflation continues or if it doesn't, and reacting your investing in accordance with that. But I think an approach that's based on the micro, to paraphrase the professor, is more likely to be successful than a macro forecast, which is not likely to be successful or accurate.
Any comments on this? Then basically, in your presentation, you assumed that inflation is a kind of permanent shock rather than transitory shock. So in that case, we anyhow need to come up with a potential solution
Right.
to solve some inflation issues in
Right.
the mid and long-term perspective. So any possible solutions to inflation risk in the long term?
Well, none of us know, including me, whether inflation will be a longer-term problem or not. I'm concerned it could be. On the other hand, you know, AI may make, and I know we're going to have presentations on AI this afternoon, it's possible that AI will introduce so much efficiency that people don't need labor, and it's deflationary. I don't know, and nobody else knows either. So, but what I can tell you is, if you look at the position of a particular company, you can make an assessment about that company's ability to deal with inflation. You can make an assessment as to whether or not that company's market position, whether the demand for its product is so high, so unique, that it's going to be able to pass on to its customer, who will have but very little alternative. Or conversely, whether perhaps it's not in a particularly strong competitive position, such that it's predictable that inflation is going to end up cutting in with profit margin. So I think if you look at a particular company, and then, you know, if you're a credit investor, you know, inflation may only be a risk insofar as it risks or doesn't risk a company's ability to pay back its debts. So you can make, if you get into the detail, you can make an assessment.
Okay. Then let me have some final questions. So in Thomas' presentations, we learned that in early 1900, we had some Great Depression, but at the time, the JP Morgan, which was a private-owned financial company, could have a leading role of such a financial alliance to overcome the financial crisis. So we are now at the inflation crisis. So I believe there may be some possibilities between public companies and non-public companies to form some specific types of alliances. So do you think any possibilities for us to form such an alliance between private and public partnerships?
Well, first of all, I would say that inflation is an issue today, but I don't know that I would call it a crisis. I've lived through experiences where inflation in the United States was 10 or 12% a year. We see in certain Latin American countries where today inflation in Argentina, I don't know what it is, but it may be 40 or 50% a year. So I wouldn't say, generally speaking, whether in Korea or the United States, that it's a crisis yet. You know, you talk about whether or not there's possibility for alliances. While I'm not particularly optimistic, or I don't see a huge amount of opportunity for such alliances, I do want to make a historical reference, which I think is very responsive to your question. When Gerald Ford was president in the early 1970s, Richard Nixon resigned as president of the United States in 1974, was succeeded by Gerald Ford, who was president for 2 or 3 years. And it was at this period I talked about when I graduated from college, when inflation was very, very significant in the United States. And Gerald Ford tried to create a partnership or an alliance of exactly what you're describing. He urged, he wore a pin on his lapel that said WIN. And what that stood for was whip inflation now. And his idea was that if private industry would stop raising prices, if private industry would stop giving wage increases to workers, we could, quote, whip inflation now. It was an enormous failure, and Ford was widely ridiculed, and it was one component of him not winning re-election. and losing to Jimmy Carter in 1976. I'm not sure it was a dispositive factor, but it did sort of humiliate him. So whether that private partnership could have been successful or not, it wasn't. So there is some historical precedent.
Okay, let me make some final questions. So let me assume that we decide to form some specific types of financial alliance, but there are some market frictions such as asymmetric information, limited enforcement, or even moral hazard issues. So Thomas, what do you think, how could we efficiently improve some transparency in order to handle such market frictions when we are forming some specific types of alliances?
I think that basically it's the presence of the frictions is not something the alliance will mitigate. It's going to be something that will let the alliance form. So you basically need and microeconomic policies in your country, which it's going to be much easier to form alliances in countries which have good governance systems, effective accounting systems which actually reflect asset values, widespread dissemination of information, and you're going to have a lot more alliances formed if you have in countries with poor protection of property rights, lack of information, transparency, and that's what you see. You see, there's a lot of developing countries, the model has sort of been the conglomerate, which is another way of ensuring cooperation, right? And that's basically, so you're internalizing your governance system, basically. So you say, we can't do arm's length dealings with each other because we can't trust each other, we can't enforce contracts, we don't believe anything you say, so instead I'm going to buy you and I can tell you what to do, right? And then so you get this, like the Tatas in India, where they became sort of, they own all sorts of different things, but people, what they're actually, their economy of scale or scope, their economy is that they're a Tata firm, so I trust them, right? Because it's kind of a very, it's not the most, it's a rather cumbersome way of establishing trust, but yeah, so I'd say reform is the best thing you can do to encourage alliance formation within a firm, within a given country.
Then fintech or AI or data science can improve some transparency, in your opinion?
Well, certainly, more availability of data is going to be if it's cheaper, then it's similar to making it. There are things that restrict the production of information. One of them is cost. So yes, by driving that down, it should make it easier to form alliances because it basically increases the information symmetry or parity.
Then lastly, in terms of international cooperation, what do you think of the current level of Korean society in terms of standardization or some levels of international cooperation? So do you think is Korean society quite attractive to foreigners, or there are lots of still barriers to overcome at the moment?
I'm not enough of an expert to be able to comment specifically, except to say that, Korea's economic advancement over the last 30 or 40 years has been a miracle of the world. So clearly, whatever policies might inhibit cooperation have not been sufficient to interfere with Korea's ascension into the very top order of world economies. And as I see just as an amateur, observe Korean industry moving its production away from China and into other of the developing world, dealing with the tensions that exist, as I think about how Korea has managed to manage its political situation vis-a-vis North Korea, and the fact that there's a power that is very heavily armed, just a few miles away from where we sit today. Far be it for I to give any counsel to Korea as to how you ought to be doing it better. It seems to me you're doing it very, very well.
Okay. Then, thanks very much for great comments and suggestions for us to go ahead in order to form some strategically financial alliance to solve lots of practical issues and challenges facing us. Thank you so much today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.